Today, I'll discuss how voice modulation can make you a more precise and personable speaker. Your voice is far more than a practical tool for speaking. You can actually play it much like an instrument. That's because it's an incredibly complicated art form, and it can convey and illustrate far more than you might suspect. It can play the highest and lowest of notes, and it can reach the back of virtually any room. So surely mastering the use of your voice can make you a better communicator. In fact, your voice is more functional than you think. Not only can it both elicit and convey the right emotions, but it can also underscore the operative words in your sentence and actually serve as a means of emphasis. And much like body language, it can make you more engaging and charismatic. There's so much encoded detail in how we modulate our voice, and it can dramatically change the interpreted meaning of your words. In the scope of effective communication in public speaking, it is an absolutely necessary core competency. So one of our primary objectives in public speaking is to elicit or evoke a certain emotion from our audience. Now that emotion, whatever it may be, is allied with the overarching objective of any speech or presentation, right? So if I wanted to win an election, I would need to stoke feelings of hope and optimism. If I wanted to besmirch my enemy in that election, I would need to make people feel enraged or betrayed. But if I wanted to raise money for a charity, I'd be relying on feelings of sympathy. Now, these tactics are typically used in advertising, but we can reapply them and rework them in the public speaking context as well. And one of the ways in which we can do that is through how we modulate our voice. For example, President Obama, politics aside, was an excellent orator. In a single speech, he could guide an audience of thousands through a fairly impressive range of emotions, and they'd all be feeling precisely the same thing at the same time. If he wanted to really excite or galvanize his listeners, he would heighten his tone and quicken his pace, and you could almost detect a cadence or a rhythm in the way that he spoke. But if he wanted to simmer down and discuss something more solemn, he would lower his pitch, slow down, and even incorporate pauses where necessary to allow for retention. That variability, that roller coaster of emotions, as you can imagine, created quite the experience for his audience. And his manner of speech is actually in large part what made him so persuasive. His 2004 address, in large part, is what won him his election in 2008. So the reason that voice modulation is so consistently effective, and the reason that Obama, or really any proficient speaker, can make millions of people feel exactly the same way, is that there's not much variability in how we interpret voice. That's because we're really innately sensitive to emotional cues. Infants, for example, can actually recognize emotional tones naturally in their caregivers' voices from an incredibly early age. And so voice modulation is something we can rely on to set the right ambience and to elicit the right emotions at the right time. So beyond conveying emotion, voice modulation is actually a form of emphasis by which we can identify what we call operative words in a sentence. Now, as discussed in the body language video, operative words are underscored or emphasized words that can change the underlying or implicit meaning of a sentence. Take, for example, the sentence, "I'm going to the grocery store." Now, in prose, this sentence simply indicates that I'm going to the grocery store. But if I were to say I'm going to the grocery store, now the meaning is certainly a little bit different. By underscoring or intoning the word "the," I'm suggesting that the grocery store I'm going to is perhaps better than any other. After all, it's not just any grocery store, it's the grocery store, right? So the words we choose to emphasize by means of, let's say, intonation, for example, can completely change the connotative or implicit meaning of the sentence. But it's not just intonation that can add emphasis and change meaning. Slowing down your pace, for example, can allow for retention. Pausing can allow for contemplation. Even heightening your pitch can highlight some words over others. As discussed in our last video, emphasis of any kind, be it audible or visual, identifies to the audience that some words or ideas are more important than others. And by establishing that relative importance, we can change the connotative or suggestive meaning of our words. And that's something that written language doesn't really allow us to do. So one thing you'll typically notice about charismatic and engaging speakers is that they incorporate vocal variety into their spoken delivery. And much like how body language can give the audience more to look at, voice modulation gives them more to listen to, more notes, more volumes, and certainly a broader range of emotions. That correspondingly gives people a better sense of you, your identity, your character, and your persona. And that's certainly something we want to achieve when public speaking. We don't want to be a garden variety presenter. We want to be personable and engaging. So Jerry Seinfeld actually does a fantastic job of this, particularly in his comedic works, but as well in any interpersonal conversation you'll see him having on TV. He always uses voice modulation, of course, to engage his listeners, but as well to give them a sense of how he feels in the moment. Now, we all know Seinfeld to, by default, have a very animated and bubbly personality, but his voice and the way he uses it is in no small part what makes him memorable. And that's what we want to achieve as public speakers, as presenters, is memorability. You know, most people at your job or at your school will certainly not go out of their way to make themselves more noteworthy and engaging. So the dynamic elements of voice modulation and body language can set you apart in remarkable ways. So hopefully you see just how useful voice modulation can be in conveying emotion, in providing emphasis, and of course in enhancing your presence with salience and charisma. Now at the moment, you may not be using the entirety of your vocal bandwidth, and that's much like only knowing a handful of notes on the piano or any other instrument. But as you discover the many capabilities of your voice, be that pitch, intonation, pace, pause, or projection, you'll begin to captivate your listeners and elicit emotions that words could never really amount to. Very much like your favorite song. Thanks for watching.